Center. This summer series, Encounters with Jesus, has had us studying some of the most vivid, life-altering encounters that Jesus has with a whole variety of individuals, sometimes close friends, sometimes confidants, sometimes religious leaders, Pharisees, sometimes large crowds, oftentimes the marginalized. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of profound, life-changing encounters in the Gospels. This summer, you've just scratched the surface. But I want to show you one more of these examples this morning. And in every case, these encounters that Jesus has, nobody walks away unchanged or unfazed. As the physical presence of the divine, Jesus displays the heart and character of the Father, and through his words and his actions, he heals, he confounds, he inspires, and he loves. But regardless, these encounters are always life-changing. And in my last opportunity this summer, I want to teach a description of Jesus and an encounter he has with some of his disciples, his close friends. And on this occasion, Jesus is going to illustrate a very profound theological truth with a story, with a parable. Now, I think that the parables really capture Jesus as his teaching best. I've always called Jesus the master teacher, the master communicator. Jesus does some of his most memorable teaching work in parables. These are fictional stories designed to illustrate the truth of God's kingdom. Now, it is absolutely true that sometimes when Jesus speaks in parables, his listeners are frustrated by them. Matthew, in his gospel, says at one point that some of the disciples come and confront the rabbi Jesus, saying, "Hey, Rabbi, why do you use so many stories when you talk to people? Why don't you just say things straight up without all the illustrations?" But Jesus keeps right on going. He keeps telling the stories one after another. Almost a third of Jesus' recorded words are parables. There's roughly 40 of them in the New Testament. And again, they're all designed to make the truth about God and his kingdom available to anybody. Now, some of the parables are complex. Sometimes they produce as much confusion as understanding. Sometimes Jesus says stuff that's strange and confusing. He makes unusual comparisons. Occasionally, he's even on the edge of irrelevant. He finds nothing wrong with using questionable characters even to describe God's truth. He tells stories about crooked judges and savage kings and tipsy slave owners and unfair business people. He tells followers that the kingdom of God is available to babies sooner than respectable religious folks. He says it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than for a solid citizen to get into the kingdom. And here we are in Cold Lake, Alberta in 2026, thousands of years later, and the parables of Jesus continue to stretch the minds and pierce the hearts. Again, sometimes these parables convict, sometimes they encourage, and the one we're going to look at this morning is one of the latter. It's actually a favorite of mine. It contains some truth that I predict you're going to love and be encouraged by. It's in Luke chapter 18. Now, before we read the parable, I want to share something that's a little bit personal with you. Going to take advantage of the fact that, what are you going to do, fire me kind of thing? Anyway, listen, as I stand before you this morning, my heart's a little heavy, truthfully. Some of that is likely due to just accumulated stress. I work in a number of different environments, including first responder agencies like Strathcona County Emergency Services, the Strathcona RCMP, City of Edmonton, Edmonton Police Service. I'm working right now with a couple of churches that are struggling, in crisis. I spend a lot of my time these days in downtown Edmonton. I work with an organization that supports some of the most vulnerable population of our city. And so that has placed me up close and personal, literally hands-on with a lot of trauma and tragedy. And that work in totality can be rather emotionally demanding. Now, there's some other factors contributing to what I've been feeling lately, including some stuff that comes with being part of a family. In my extended family, we're navigating some tough stuff right now, including declining health in sibling and some challenges affecting our kids. But a lot of my heaviness, I think, comes from just dozens and dozens of conversations and pastoral counseling situations with people in my community, in my circle, that are hurting. Been around a lot of hurting people lately. My wife, Corinne, is here, and she treats hepatitis for a living. She's an RN, which means that she's always, on a daily basis, around people from the margins of society, people who are struggling in their own way. And so it's very common for us both to come home, and we have a routine, either in our kitchen, on our couch, wherever it happens to be, but we generally reconnect with each other at the end of the day. And it's very common for us to each tell our stories of the people that we were around that day that are struggling and that are hurting. In fact, one of our little pet phrases that we use sometimes is like, people's lives suck. Like, there's just a lot of people hurting. And we just both kind of compare notes and just like, this is a heavy, broken world. We reflect often on just how many hurting people there are. Side note, it's been a little bit of a frustration to me about the way churches function, is that a lot of us, when we come to a place like this, we mask what's really going on. We create the impression in church environments that we're doing great sometimes, when in reality we may not be. Way too much church life, I fear, is experienced on the surface level. We come to a place like this, we say, hey, how you doing? And we give each other, yeah, pretty good, I'm fine. When in truth, we may not be fine. I know whenever I stand before any size crowd, and this is a pretty good sized crowd this morning, even if you tell me on the outside, yeah, I'm doing fine, I'm doing great, I know that on the inside, some of you, maybe many of you, struggling, your soul aches, your soul is tired. Inside, you may not be fine. Some of you have heavy hearts this morning. Some of you are hurting. Some of you are confused. Some of you are scared. For some of you, whatever it is you're going through has you legitimately questioning God's presence in your life. Some of you are struggling with physical pain. Some of you are in the middle of a relational crisis, or you're in the aftermath of one. Some of you have kids going sideways. Some of you have parents going through divorce. Some of you are grieving because of something that is happening to you or has happened to you or someone you love. Some of you just long to have someone to love. Some of you are wondering if that person you've been praying for will ever embrace Jesus. You've been praying for years. You're struggling to keep it up. Some of you have lost heart for one reason or another. You don't feel optimistic, and you're not sure how much more your faith can take. And so you don't really feel like praying because you're not even sure it's doing any good. So let's turn to Luke 18. In context, Jesus is making his way to Jerusalem. I'm not going to go back and kind of establish the whole context. Just know that Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem and all that waits for him there. If you don't know the end of the story in Luke, it's the whole Easter narrative. Like, he's headed towards Jerusalem and he's talking with his disciples and who knows how many others. And he knows that some of them have heavy hearts. Some of them may be questioning a lot. They may be giving up on God. And so Jesus, recognizing what's going on in their minds, teaches them an important lesson about God and the way his kingdom works. So this is Luke 18, starting at verse 1. Then Jesus told his disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. He said, in a certain town there was a judge who neither feared God nor cared what people thought. And there was a widow in that town who kept coming to him with the plea, grant me justice against my adversary. For some time he refused, but finally he said to himself, even though I don't fear God or care what people think, boy, that's self-disclosure, even though I don't fear God or care what people think, yet because this widow keeps bothering me, I'll see that she gets justice so that she won't eventually come and attack me. And the Lord said, listen to what the unjust judge says. And will not God bring about justice for his chosen ones who cry out to him day and night? Will he keep putting them off? I tell you, he will see that they get justice and quickly. However, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on the earth? This is one of my favorite parables. And it's really not that complicated, but it is easily misunderstood, I think. So let me walk you back through it, and I want to make sure you don't miss what I think is really just one main point. So let me set this up this way. There's two characters in the parable. The first one is a widow. Now, widow is still a term that we use in our culture today, though it's a little bit old school. We don't use it that much. But a widow or widower is someone whose spouse has died and they've not remarried. In 2026, there's not that much stigma associated with being a widow. Somebody can be a widow and be a very prominent citizen. There are widows who are moms and mayors and business leaders and principals of schools. Being a widow does not carry automatic socio or economic disadvantage in our culture today. But in the culture where Jesus tells this story, completely different deal. This is very different. Those listening to Jesus tell his story recognize from the very beginning that it's a depressing story, because in first century Palestine, to be a widow is to basically have a horrible existence. In the first century Middle East, if a woman loses her husband, she essentially loses her identity. Widows are almost always destitute, powerless, and disconnected. And so when those listening to Jesus teach and tell the story hear him say there was a widow in that town, they're all picturing the same thing. They're all picturing a lower class person with very little to live for, someone who's barely a person, someone who's got very few options. Jesus is describing a helpless person, a vulnerable widow. And if that's not bad enough, someone's out to get her. Jesus says that she has some kind of an opponent, an adversary. Someone's harassing her, hassling her. Jesus doesn't say what the woman's trouble is. Maybe she's struggling to pay her bills. Maybe she's behind in rent. It could be that someone's extorting money from her. All we know for sure is that she's in trouble and she needs someone to help her. Now, the only other character in the story is a judge. In first century Palestine, judges like this are all powerful. If you're trying to imagine or picture the contrast with a modern day Canadian judge, well, that's a pretty powerful person too. But in our context, judges don't possess absolute power. In our legal system, there's checks and balances. There's appeals courts. There's a Supreme Court that can review decisions made in lower courts, and sometimes they'll overrule those decisions. But the kind of judge that Jesus is describing is someone with full and lasting authority. Nobody's watching over them. Nobody's challenging their decisions. They have absolute power. I was thinking about whether or not somebody with absolute power exists in our culture today. Now, this is not an apples to apples comparison, but the best I could come up with is like a border agent or customs official. Bear with me just for a second, but they have a certain freedom to search people, search bags and vehicles. They can detain, they can make in-the-moment decisions on who or who isn't granted admission into Canada. I'm not suggesting that the men and women who patrol our borders and monitor our points of entry are unethical or they literally have absolute power, but I've talked to a few of them, and they've described for me how broad their authority is. I know somebody who transitioned from being a customs and border agent to local law enforcement, and they told me that it was a difficult transition because as a police officer, they have certain rules governing searches and seizures. They have to follow certain rules, probable cause and all of that. But at the border, just someone's instinct, even the slightest bit of suspicion, a border agent can basically take a vehicle apart. For the local police, the burden of probable cause is much stricter. And so in our parable here, we've got an all-powerful judge and all that means. No restrictions, no probable cause rules. He operates with impunity, no checks and balances. Whatever he determines and rules, that's what goes. And Jesus says something else quite fascinating and discouraging, actually, about him. Jesus says in verse 2 that this judge doesn't fear God and doesn't care what people think. Like, that's a sobering description. That's a dangerous combination. Can you think of anybody in a position of authority who has no respect for higher authority? Let your brain go a little bit here. Kim Jong-un, North Korea. Supposedly, he's executed some high-ranking government officials who he's perceived as a threat, who dared to disagree with him, or supposedly, the rumor is, one that fell asleep in an important meeting. Putin? Donald Trump? Too soon? Yeah. Watch the news. Watch parts of Africa and the Middle East. Certain portions of Asia are dominated by totalitarian dictators who appear to have no respect for higher authority. And think about what you were taught when you took history in school. Most of history's worst atrocities have been committed by leaders operating from positions of power with no respect for higher authority. A dangerous combination. Someone who's in high power has no respect for higher authority. That's the kind of person Jesus is describing. A person who's powerful and doesn't give a rip about what anybody else thinks. That's a dangerous person. So again, back to the picture Jesus is painting. Jesus is describing this scenario where you've got a poor, powerless, unconnected, vulnerable widow needing help, and the only person who can possibly help her is a mean-spirited, unaccountable, uncaring judge. And I think what Jesus is doing here, the way he tells the story, is he's forcing the listeners to consider in their minds the odds. He's saying, in effect, what do you think the odds are of her getting help? What do you think the chances are of a woman like this getting her needs met by that kind of guy? I'm not into gambling or betting, but as a sports fan, I do sometimes look at the betting lines and the odds for certain sports. I did that this week. I checked the odds for next year's Stanley Cup. The Oilers' odds of winning it all are listed at plus 950. If you don't know what that means, it's basically A $100 bet will win you $950 should the Oilers win the cup next year. Some of you are thinking, I think I'll do that. Anyway, don't go there. Those are the fourth best odds of any team, by the way. The Florida Panthers have the best odds at plus 650. Rounding out the top is the Avalanche and the Hurricanes. They're both at plus 750. And at the other end of the scale are the Flames at 40,000, plus 40,000, and the Canucks at plus 50,000. Yuck. Sorry, Canucks fans, Flames fans, you're in for a long year, at least according to the bookmakers. Anyway, imagine again being in the circle as Jesus tells this story about a widow and a judge, and think about being an odds maker. What odds are you going to give for this woman being taken care of? Plus 950? Plus 40,000, plus 50,000. Now, in the circle, listening to Jesus tell this story, are a bunch of guys who have heard Jesus speaking in parables before. And I'm going to speculate that some of them assume that the story is allegorical. In most of Jesus' stories, one of the characters in the story represents God. This is what they're used to. So again, I'm going to do a little reading between the lines here, but perhaps they're thinking, okay, some of us have heavy hearts. Yes, we're struggling. We're thinking about quitting this little venture we're on here. We're not sure. We're questioning whether or not this is really happening like we hope. We're questioning the prayers that we're praying for ourselves and for Israel, which means, I guess, we're like the widow in the story, which then must also mean that God is like the judge, a powerful being, but busy, like with lots going on, and that person can't really be bothered by the little problems like the ones we have. Most New Testament commentators believe this is exactly how Jesus' listeners would have understood the story. In first century Palestine, judges would usually perform their duties in large open halls or courts, maybe a room like this size. And at one end of the hall, maybe on a raised platform or something like that, a judge would sit on this elevated spot called a qadi, or the judge would be kind of sit in a big area surrounded by cushions, and around him would be all sorts of secretaries and nobles. And at the appointed hour, the public would be let into the hall, and dozens of them may come forward and begin to clamor all at once, begging for their case to be heard. An experienced few might go, that's not the play here. I'm going to go up to the side and maybe find one of the underlings here and, kind of slip some coins or a bit of a bribe, hoping to get my case heard. People are trying to figure out a way to get the judge's attention. And so perhaps if an appropriate bribe is given, the judge might be inclined to kind of whisper some judgment that will help that person out. Oftentimes, justice would go to the person with the highest bribe. So in a situation like this poor widow with all of these other people clamoring around with very few resources to bring to the table would have very little chance. She's got no standing in the community. She's got no resources for a bribe. This is the image that Jesus creates. A chaotic hall filled with people clamoring for justice. But somehow, this little woman gets up close to the judge. She manages to get kind of right up in his dish, and she puts her hands in front of him and says, "I've got a problem." But the judge just looks at her and says, get lost. But the woman has no place else to turn, and so she keeps at it. She comes to the same hall day after day. She gets right up close. She works her way up there and just badgers him. And every time she does, he just, get out of here, sends her away. But the woman has no pride. After being rejected over and over again, she decides, I'm just going to hound him mercilessly. She vows to become his worst nightmare. And so she just comes back over and over again. She comes during the day, she comes at night. Maybe she's even showing up in the judge's dreams. I don't know, because she's so there. In verse 5, it's implied in the original language that the woman is so aggressive in her pursuit of justice that the judge starts to worry if she might actually attack him. Remember the line in the phrase there when it says she might attack me or something like that? The language scholars say that there's a Greek expression in there that can refer to another person giving someone a black eye. Like she's going to take a swing at me if she keeps at it. The judge doesn't really fear for his life, but this woman is so worked up, it's like she might try to dodge his security detail and get up close and try to smack him or something like that. So finally, after days or weeks, the judge finally says, all right, enough. Even though I don't respect higher power, and even though I could care less about her problems, I'm going to give the woman what she wants so I can get her off my back. Now notice the motivation. He just wants to make her go away. He wants to get rid of her. She's become a pain in the rear. His willingness to give her justice has nothing to do with morality or compassion. He just wants to get rid of an irritation, and so he gives her what she wants. Now again, you got to read between the lines here. Imagine the wheels turning in the minds of Jesus' listeners. Okay, if I'm like the widow and God is like the judge, the way the widow gets her needs met is she pesters the judge until he caves in and helps. And so I guess the lesson is we have a distant, busy God, and our challenge is to bang on the doors of heaven until our knuckles bleed. When we're down, if we beg and plead long enough and hard enough, maybe we can pry open the fingers of a tight-fisted God and receive the blessing that we need. Something about that doesn't sound right, but Jesus is the rabbi. He's the master teacher. And this seems to be what he's saying. I think this is the moment Jesus is waiting for. Right here. I think Jesus has reeled them in. I think they've taken the bait, hook, line, and sinker, the whole tackle box. I think they've just taken the whole thing. I think Jesus can see the disappointment on some of their faces. Some of them already came into this moment already questioning and doubting, perhaps ready to give up on the whole venture here and give up on God. Some of them had lost heart before Jesus even told the story, and now they're just feeling horrible. But Jesus uses the moment to turn their perspective on edge. He says, not sure if he's, again, I'm reading between lines, but I think Jesus says kind of like, gotcha. Some of you think that you're like the widow and my Father is like the judge, which means you have to pester him like crazy to get his attention and get help. But I told you the story the way I did to lead you to believe it was an allegory so that when I told you the truth, the vividness of the contrast would stick in your mind. Listen, I believe Jesus said, you are totally unlike the widow. You couldn't be more different. She's considered an outcast. By any measure, she doesn't count for anything or anybody, but you matter. You matter big time. You matter more than anybody. You matter so much, I'm going to spill my blood for you. I think about you all the time. My dream is to walk with you and talk with you and shape your whole life. And when that's done, I'm preparing a place for you to live with me for all eternity. There's nothing in the world that matters more to me than you. You are totally unlike the widow, and don't you forget it. And my Father is totally unlike that judge. The judge doesn't respect higher authority. My Father is the higher authority. He's holy and just and righteous and filled with compassion and grace and mercy. The judge is a wicked person who doesn't care about anybody, but my Father is known for how far he will go to show his compassion and his love. Jesus said, I tell you the story of huge odds to teach you that you are unlike the widow, and my Father is unlike the judge. The odds are great that when you come to the Father, you'll get your needs met. So pray and don't ever stop, because the Father's inclination is to help you. The teaching here of this parable is God is willing and able to bring about justice for his children that cry out to him. There's a similar parable in Luke 11. We call that one the friend at midnight. It's another story where Jesus teaches his followers to come to the Father with boldness, bold prayers. And in that parable, Jesus gives you and I permission, encouragement even, to bother God, to pray, and to pray audaciously. Jesus says repeatedly in the Gospels, ask, and it will be given to you. Seek, and you will find. Knock, and the door will be open. You are so unlike the widow in the story, and God is so unlike the judge. If your faith is teetering, and you don't feel like praying, and you've begun to lose some hope, on the authority of the Word of God, I want to urge you to pray and don't lose heart. God's disposition, God's inclination is to come alongside you and come to your aid. So, my friends, ask, seek, knock. If you've quit and stopped calling on God, scriptures say, hey, pray again, and don't stop. The odds are in your favor. So here's what I'd like to do. I asked the board and the leaders here if we could try something today that's a little bit unique. And what we're going to do is we're going to conclude this service with a time of prayer, an open altar, if you will. And so in a moment, some of the musicians and worship leaders are going to come back, and they're going to lead a couple more songs for us. And I'm going to declare the rest of our service a prayer meeting. If you've stopped praying because you don't think God cares or is listening, I'm going to challenge you in the next few minutes to start praying again. Boldly, tell God whatever it is that's weighing heavy on your heart this morning. And over the next few minutes, a handful of our elders and Pastor Morgan and myself, we're going to be down here on the front. Some of the spouses of our elders may be participating as well. But we're just going to be seated down here along the front of the stage. And while worship and singing is going on, I'm just going to encourage you to move around the room. And if you'd like to be prayed for this morning, several of us will just be right down front here, and it would be absolutely our honor to pray for you. Those of you who are going to be praying for others, if you would go ahead and kind of come down and start being seated here, why don't you go ahead and do that? And by the way, it's absolutely fine if you just want to circle up in the seats out there and pray for each other as well. You can do that, absolutely. And listen, you don't have to bare your soul with anybody here. You don't have to come down here and share a bunch of deep stuff if you don't want to. We don't need a bunch of detail to pray for you. Just simply come down here and tell these individuals just how they can pray for you. As simple as, how can I pray for you this morning? And we will be happy to do that. I believe any one of us can benefit from being prayed for this morning. The worst that's going to happen is you'll be profoundly cared for and loved. Okay, I promise you that. And when the service is over, you don't have to rush out of here, because I'm guessing a few of us are going to be here praying for each other for a while. So don't be in a hurry to run out of here today. If you think you ought to be prayed for today, I would encourage you to fight the temptation to believe that you are like the widow and God is like the judge. Now, a couple of caveats before we do this. I think we ought to remember that there are some rules and principles to keep in mind when it comes to prayer. Remember, God knows more than we do, and God knows what's best, and sometimes God sees things differently than the way we see them. I don't believe prayer is a blank check. Sometimes as we persist in prayer, it could be that what God is doing is growing our character and our faith. But having said that, Jesus says, pray and don't give up. Pray about lofty things. Pray about peace in our world. Pray about peace in Ukraine. Pray for peace between U.S. and Iran. Pray for our province, our nation, and our leaders. Pray for your kids, our kids, for those you love. Pray for those who are sick and suffering and grieving. Pray about your marriages. Pray about your job situation. Pray about your grades or your parents or about that habit you're struggling to overcome. Pray about your health. Pray and don't give up. You are the much-loved child of the Almighty God who's got love and grace and power and compassion for you and your circumstance. Let's pray right now. Join me if you would. So, Father God, as we